All right, hello everyone. Good to be back.
Being held hostage, help.
It's wild in here. It's so wild.
It is wild. So, John, what are we talking about?
This is totally against my will. I just want to say that straight up. We were talking about how we would maybe approach this essay. This essay being, what number is this? Number 7. Essay number 7 in Hayden White's Tropics of Discourse, Essays and Cultural Criticism. This is the Forms of Wildness, Archeology of an Idea. And it is, keeping with the title, it is a history starting with what we could call First Testament or Old Testament, if you prefer times, Hebraic religion, all the way through medieval theology, the history of what started to become known in, I guess, the Enlightenment as the noble savage, the sort of character that's distant, has some sort of distance from civilization, either just a sort of a liminality or a complete removal. And he talks about both. But it is basically just a history of that idea over maybe a 20 or 25 century long history. And it's kind of unusual in the middle of the book. It's one of the things we were talking about before we started the video. It's like reading half of a book of literary criticism, which is exactly like how this is read up until now, and then stumbling across an essay on some particular form of intellectual history or something. It's interesting, but I'm curious to see how during the process of the next 45 minutes or so, how we're going to make this as interesting to our audience.
That's great. That was great. Thank you, John. Maybe
He's
I
muted himself because he doesn't want me to hear the laughter.
I muted myself because I don't want us to hear my cat, who's very talkative and who has more things to say about this essay than us, I think, combined. I'll add a few things and then I'll pass it on to the great OG Rose. So you already mentioned the idea of distance from civilization. We can also add the idea of foreignness. So the wildness is a foreign element to civilization, to the structure of society. And because it is foreign, it could potentially also pose a threat. It can pose a threat to the fabric of society, to what is holding us all together. I can maybe just briefly mention a recent anecdote. I was in a meeting like this one, a Zoom meeting, and there was a person in the meeting who was not following all the norms of Zoom meetings. So in the middle, she wanted to leave the meeting, and instead of saying, okay, everyone, bye, she just said leaving, and then she left. So that was like a wild, because she introduced elements into a kind of behavior that is not kind of like threatening. It's like, okay, what if everybody starts behaving that way? And that kind of behavior makes us, makes us aware of, right. It makes us aware of what it is that we are doing. So it's a kind of, since this concept of wildness, the wild man, is traveling in time. It is traveling in time across history, and it's changing, but maybe something is not changing. And that thing that is not changing is maybe the function of the wild man concept, the wild human, even though its meaning is going through variations, but it is doing something for us by creating some kind of boundary.
I will say, if Daniel, you don't mind me saying just one thing before we go on, I like how he introduced at the beginning of the essay, he talked about how this was essentially a definition that's negative in nature. Mm-hmm. How it's very, when we say we are of civilization, when we are civilized, and someone might add, or sort of ask in repost, what do you mean by civilized? Well, it's very easy to say, I'm not that. It's very hard to say what you are in a positive sense when you say you are civilized, but it's very easy to point to someone else. Excuse me, I'm getting over a week-long thing with my throat. It's very easy to point to something else that you define yourself negatively against and define yourself in that way. He talks about W.B. Galley talking about democracy, art, and the Christian way of life as essentially contested concepts, which he would say civilization is one too. Well, I mean, if you can only define it negatively, I mean, it probably is easily contested. But I like the fact that he opened it up, admitting, making space for the fact that it was a negative definition, and that's how we're proceeding.
Oh no, that's excellent, John. And no, it was pretty wild to have this section of the book in the middle of this work on history, and then boom, the forms of wildness. And you're like, oh, and I told everyone before the break, I'm extremely tempted every time I mention the wild man to do it in a Jack Black voice, like the wild man. But I will spare our viewers that. But you keep imagining it, viewers. Keep imagining it, because I thought it'd be great. So the forms of wildness. No, that's exact. I was going to read that. I love it. I really liked toward the beginning when he says, if we do not know what we think civilization is, we can always find an example of what it is not. If we are unsure of what sanity is, we can at least identify madness when we see it. So there's a negative element. He brings up Foucault and talking about all those different things. And I think that's very important, because it tends to be easier to say what a city is not. But when you start saying what a city is, there can be some hesitancy because you don't want to kind of cut off possibilities or exclude different variables and nuances. And then also too, like if somebody asks you what is a city, you start realizing it's almost like Plato, right? Where you've always used the word justice, you've always known what freedom, and then somebody's like, well, define it. And you're like, not too sure. And so you find yourself in that position. I found, like you say, it was an interesting essay. We're talking about, it made me think about the great debate between like Hobbes and Rousseau, where Rousseau, the noble savage, the person that in nature is great. And then Hobbes is like, no, in nature, human beings were barbaric and it was terrible. And so for Rousseau, in society, we're everywhere in chains. And for Hobbes, society is what keeps us from killing one another. And what's interesting for both is, it's not like any of these guys ever actually encountered somebody in the wilderness. They got reports from these different outer lands or different things, but mainly they were using the idea of the person outside of civilization to ground their philosophy or to ground their framework or to ground their civilization. And I think Mr. White did a very good job kind of going through history, talking about how the wild man as a category, is used to ground and legitimize various social orders or to talk about how they are uniquely organized. He talks about with the Greeks, how the wild person is someone outside the city. If you're in the city, that doesn't mean you're necessarily fully human, but if you're outside the city, you certainly aren't fully human. Like there's a possibility of achieving a full humanity in the city that cannot occur outside the city. And he was talking about how I also thought it was interesting where he talked about the fauna and the minotaur as examples of the wild men, like the noble savage. I hadn't thought of that. So how they were still kind of present in the myths there. But so for Greek, the wild was the outside, and in the city is where you had the civilized. And he actually argues quite interestingly that was held actually through Judaism up till Christianity. But then in Christianity, because there is an ontological fall, it is possible for everyone to be a wild man, even if they are in civilization, right? Even if they are part of the civilization. So it's no longer given that just because you are part of a social order that you're not going to be wild. So you have this movement to where wildness can be understood by external circumstances, to this movement where wild is not where anyone can be wild, which simultaneously, it's kind of interesting. What I was thinking about as I read that, if anyone can be wild, then there's a humility that can come with that, because you could be born to a great family but still give into your sin nature. So there's no given that just because you have a good family you're not a sinner. But with that can also come a certain anxiety and paranoia, because if anyone can be wild, you can't be safe, right? You always have to be aware. So it's interesting how there could be a kind of humility you get with the internalization of wildness, but also a paranoia that could be, or a nervousness that could be developed with the internalization of wildness. And before I pass it back to Davood, I also it got me thinking how wild the wild is still with us today as a structure for ideology. You know, like conservatives are always talking about how liberals are destroying America. Well, what are they saying? The liberals are destroying, you know, they're the wild ones. They're tearing down the country. But then, you know, liberals turn on and you know, that conservatives are the backwater people who don't understand anything. So it's funny how there's still very, you know, you go to college, you're civilized. If you don't go to college, you're not civilized. These are all generalities, but it's interesting how there still actually is kind of a language of a wild person that exists today to organize various ideological camps and social orders. So like I said, it was pretty wild to have this in the middle of it. And I could take some random, this is the part where I'm tempted to try to connect it to all the stuff about history, but nothing that I say will be found in the essay. So, you know, we'll be pouring in from the top, but it might be fun. But I'll save that, you know, hey, why not, right? It'll be wild. But I thought it was very interesting. I did find it was an interesting work, but like we say, it was quite out of the blue. So I'll pass it on.
Thank you. There is some continuity, given that the previous essay was about irrationality and how Enlightenment thinkers discuss rationality and irrationality, and how this wildness is the ultimate form of irrationality, because the being of the creature is wild. Yeah, I like that the distinction between the Greek style of treating wildness and the Hebrew tradition. And the division was very clear cut. It was almost like a spatial division. The types of being, types of animals or types of human beings that are wild or not wild. And as time goes on, this division it turns into not the division in creatures, animals, but the division in our tendencies. So we find wildness as one of the tendencies that we have. And in general, you know, these kind of fixation on one of the things that White emphasizes in this essay is that this fixation that we might have at some points in history with purity, moral purity, is one of the things that gives rise. It quite, I mean, very predictably gives rise to this idea of wildness as the other. If I set myself the goal of being pure, having very high and very strict moral standards, then out of that is born the idea of wildness, all the other things that I don't want to be. But if I begin, start by wanting to be a hedonist, not pure, just enjoying my life, you know, celebrate everything that is in me and in my fellow human beings, then I will probably not, if I'm not fixated on the idea of purity, then I probably won't fixate on and be threatened as much by the idea of wildness. So that is kind of like, I felt like, and feel free to point out if I'm wrong, I felt like that's one of the advantages of the Greek tradition over the Hebrew tradition. The way they approached wildness was less clear-cut. It was more like, yeah, we have them too. Occasionally, we have this one. And the barbarians are not that different. They are in different kinds of relationships. We are in the civilized society because we have a kind of state that comes out of being in relation to each other according to the law of the laws of the city. That's what makes us not wild. Anyways.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how there's a word, uses the word theonomic. As far as, was it the Hebrews who thought that because it wasn't Christians, I don't think. They thought that, let's just assume it was Hebrews, that theonomic being from nomos, law, and theo, God, as long as you basically followed any kind of law, whether that was the law of the city, the Greek law of the pagan gods, or anything else, as long as you followed some sort of recognition that you weren't the end all and be all, that you had potential to progress and maybe perhaps work your way into the polis and become a fully rational zoon politikon, you know. But I was also interested, as I read on, it it seems like, and especially you get this in Hobbes, the Hobbes versus Rousseau line of debates with the savage, with the noble savage. And I'm not talking about examples, but I mean, can anyone think of anything like a wild person? And I mean, I was thinking about things associated with civilization that you can slowly strip away. You know, say like you live without electricity. That doesn't make you wild. If you live without electricity and water, that doesn't make you wild. Where does, I mean, who exactly is wild? Because I mean, there are a lot of people today who don't have a lot of the, and here we are having a Zoom meeting, right? Who don't have a lot of the amenities that we have, but probably wouldn't think of themselves as wild. We may not consider them that either. Where does the, when we think of a wild person, when Hobbes and Rousseau thought of a noble savage, what do you think they were really thinking of? Because I mean, usually what you get a picture of is, you know, someone in a headdress that sort of evokes an American Indian, right? Not anything close to what a savage would have been. Yes, they had some run-ins with colonists, but had their own laws, had their own ways, their own religions, their own folk ways and mythologies and creation tales and music and storytelling and everything else. There's no way, I mean, we should be rightly offended when we see pictures like that associated with the noble savage, I think. What do you think they were thinking about? Or the Greeks were thinking about when they used the word wild man or noble savage? I think that's an interesting question.
Oh, no, I think that's an excellent line of inquiry. I think, you know, on the, you know, I doubt they were thinking of, I think it was a boy in Chile named Vincent who was raised kind of in the wilderness by, like, literally by wolves. So I think there's been a few instances of this, maybe 30 or something in world history. And, you know, we studied in linguistics on language and different things and how language formed. And, you know, these were these arguments that if you don't have language, you're not human, and all the, you know, how it's like hard to develop, and the formation of the subconscious without language, and all, you know, all these different studies that people, it's interesting because you almost see that when an actual feral, I guess, what is it called? Feral child. When an actual feral child is found, everyone rushes in. They're like, we found one. Let's find out what it's really like. You know, how does the human actually develop? And different things. And I think there was also someone, when they were cutting down parts of the rainforest, they think there was someone in there that they found that was completely disconnected from civilization, but I don't know enough about that. You know, it's very interesting. I think so much, I think to Mr. White's point, so much of the quote unquote savage is tied to people's myths. Like there are certain stories of how the world was created, how they think the world goes. You know, as much as Rousseau perhaps, despite his secular, whatever his religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs may have been, there's a sort of Eden view of the noble savage, where really the word savage is problematic. I almost want to think about, if I'm not mistaken, in more of a Greek society, I think this will tie into Aristotle's quote on the idea that if you don't live in society, you're either an animal or a god. Well, right there, it's kind of interesting. You can't assume, therefore, that someone outside of society is not a god, but you also can't assume they're like you. So there's this interesting kind of balancing act, I think, like you're mentioning, where you can't just, you can other them in both a positive and a negative way, right? It can't be like being wild is necessarily all bad, as it would seem to be in, say, Christianity. But I believe in Greek thought that an idiot was defined as someone who was outside of society. It didn't mean they were intellectually stupid. It meant they were more outside of society, doing their own thing, quote unquote. So an idiot was someone who was kind of you couldn't conceptualize them because they were independent. That didn't mean they were dumb, but that also meant that they were not living in such a manner that they could be understood in the nexus of relations known as society. Maybe that's because they were a god. Maybe that's because they were an idiot. It was kind of this, I almost want to say Schrodinger's cat in honor of Davood's cat, the wonderful cat. You know, so it's kind of this both-ness that you can't know. And because you had that both-ness, I think it made space for a Rousseau to say, oh, it's more like gods. And oh, for an Hobbes, it's more like idiots. It's more like savages. It's more bad. Because, you know, if you're an animal, what do animals do? They kill and eat each other, right? So I think also maybe it gets tied, since the noble savage, the idiot, the exile, the outsider, is basically a blank canvas, unless you actually meet a feral child. Then you can just project into it what you want. And that's actually one of the reasons why it's so problematic, because you can basically use it to ground whatever philosophical system you want. You know, I've always kind of had problem with those kind of, what are they called, hypothetical contracts that people come up with to say, well, this is how we probably would be without civilization, therefore the social order as such is justified. And you never are responsive. It becomes axiomatic. It becomes the sort of grounding for your axioms. But I think where they got their ideas from would be tied, you know, to be more specific, I think it's going to be tied into if you're part of a romantic movement, if it depends on who you're reading, maybe it's based on your upbringing, maybe if your parents told you, you know, they had a harsh child, you know, you're risen and your parents are always telling you that you're a crazy kid, but you were, you know, your parents didn't spare the rod. So you're given the impression that if your parents didn't spare the rod, you would have been a crazy kid. And then of course, Rousseau does all of Emily on education. So I think it could, John, have a lot to do with the particular, how the particular child is rose, what their background is. I'm not sure. It would be interesting. Maybe it is deeper where the particular towns they came from taught something about this, or maybe they read certain books. That's kind of interesting why they went the various directions they went in. But I can see where the idiot is a space where people can project in whatever they kind of want to project in, or that they feel is right based on their own personal background.
Yeah, it just seems like, of course, we can point to these isolated cases, and I think ultimately that's probably what you would have to do.
Yeah.
But it seems like when we talk about, and maybe it's just because of these simplistic representations that we see in school books of the noble savages, it seems like when we find them, we're going to find a society of them. And then when you stop to think for half of a second, you can't have a society of noble savages, because then they wouldn't be noble savages.
Right.
But they would necessarily have to be sort of on their own, wandering, not settled. But yeah, it's sort of, he mentions, is his name E.R. Dodd, The Greeks and the Irrational, that great book from the 30s or 40s. He talks in the book a lot about what Greeks thought made you human. And I thought, you know, the Greeks were very, very stringent with their, you know, in order to be civilized, you had to be not only have Greek language, not just language, but Greek language. And you had to be a Greek citizen living in the city. Women and slaves were recognized to some extent, but not in the same way that adult males were. It seems like when you have a particularly ascendant place in world history or world power, then your notion of yourself is awfully lofty. Because this is, of course, a time when Greeks had a lot of power. This coming off the back of you know, the rise of Italy and everything. But it's interesting to see how their notions of what was a citizen versus what was wild were so wide. And I mean, he doesn't talk about the Greeks any more than he talks about the Christians or the Hebrews or anything else. But for anyone who's interested in the Greeks and the Irrational, is where you'd want to go for that. It's a great book that kind of talks about the subject at length.
I noticed a double feature in the imagined the wild man, and the double feature was, on the one hand, there's this unusual potency. The wild man is powerful, partly because he is unrestrained, unregulated, not necessarily because the wild person is untouched by civilization, but just for some reason unregulated. And the other one was the amorality or even immorality, like the wild person is tricky, uses trickery and thinks about their own individual advantage because they are not attached to society. They don't have in mind the common good. They don't care about the common good, they care about themselves, and they use all that is in their power to go for go for what they want. But the extent to which that is an imagined entity, and how much evidence we need to accumulate to be sure that people like that exists is that's up to debate.
I thought there was your cat sounds like a baby.
Yeah,
It's adorable. It's adorable.
He
It
is our
sounds
baby.
like a crying baby.
The cat is
Like a
like,
mewing baby.
I am noble. I am noble. That's what the cat is saying. I am so noble.
And his cat is so beautiful. It looks like something the Egyptians would have worshipped.
Oh my
you
gosh,
know?
maybe they do. Just raising,
Maybe we can't be sure they don't.
I know that he was, you can't talk about too many things at once because then you'll have too many moving parts. But he mentions Freud once, relatively early on. And I thought, look at that.
Oh, it is beautiful. It should be worshipped. Oh my goodness. Look at it.
In fact, he's probably thinking, why am I not being worshipped by that?
I am not in the Zoom frame. What the heck?
I thought a lost opportunity here would be to talk about all of these ideas with a bigger focus on Freud. I thought Freud would have been the great tie-in to sort of, because it works with every single conception. You can tie in, there's that sort of stereotypical, diagram with the ego, right? And then it's being pulled by two things. It's being pulled up by the up towards morality and goodness and civilization or whatever by the superego, and then being pulled down into libidinousness and potency by the id. So it's the self that's being pulled in two different directions. You can think of it as towards the city and away from the city. I wish he would have done more with that. That would have been great.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He talks about how Freud and Jung and psychoanalysis in general is re-mythologizing the concept of the wild person and giving us a new way now that we have lost that confidence, the way in which we used to think about the wild person as somebody who's out there. Freud has given us the tools to have a new myth, which is like a part of ourselves. The wild man is just a part of who we are and can potentially get control over our lives. We might lose control to the wild.
Davood or Daniel, have you read Melanie Klein?
Yeah. Just
not
her important. She has a book
What?
on a case studies.
What did you say, Daniel?
I lost all my glass beads. Herman Hesse. Oh gosh, I didn't read it.
Shoot. Go on.
What do you
Go ahead. Why? Why Melanie Klein?
Well, because he mentions her, and he mentions Norman Brown. Just offhand, two people I know of but have not read or know much about. And I know Klein was sort of like kind of like Jung, kind of took her own interpretation of Freud. Is that right? Is objects theory? Is that right?
Object relation theory. Yeah.
Object relation theory.
Yeah. She said that she's.
Are we actually talking about something that Daniel knows nothing about?
Oh, that's hard. That's what is the name for that?
Nothing. I could talk about the
clean bottle. No, I'll talk about the clean bottle in physics and hide my face in shame. My connection. It just went. Oh no. Oh gosh, it's gone. I'm so sorry. No,
He's doing it.
No, it's fascinating.
No, it is a rare thing. It is really rare. Usually, it is Daniel who talks about things that I haven't heard about.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, so it's the symbolic and the real and the imaginary. But yeah, anyways, Melanie Klein proposed to make Freud more relational. So it is about the relationship between the child and the mother. She also said these things that I'm not sure whether they're necessary, like the good breast and the bad breast. So that divided relationship between the child and the mother, how the child is at the same time a source of value and pleasure. And at this, because it is out of control, because she is out of control of the child, she might mistreat the child. She's also a source of negative emotions.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
Well, I thought it was very interesting because just even going through
This this history of the concept of the wild man did almost kind of screen kind of the Freudian trade-offs that are going through in people's mind, where the wild man eventually becomes an embodiment of all of these possibilities. You know, when you're wild, you know, there's a libido. He's talking about, you can go and you can do what you want, but then also it can be wild in a destructive sense. And I also I would be extremely curious. One, I wanted to note how strange the phrase noble savage is, right? You know, we hear the word savage and we think violent, destructive, and then noble kind of means a knight, you know, upholding. And it's very interesting, that phrase. It would be interesting. I'm not sure who created that phrase. If the word savage at the time, now we just think about attack, someone who's going to attack you. And it'd be curious if savage meant something more like the idiot. I'm not sure. Like we were talking, like an idiot is an outsider doing their own thing. It would be curious. And it's interesting. It would be very interesting also when we're talking about Rousseau and Hobbes. You know, is Rousseau getting reports of the Native Americans as according to the English press, whereas Hobbes is getting them from another source, you know, that you're hearing about, which, and also I wonder how much the idea of the wild one is relative to the existence of frontiers, you know, the frontier theory, which frontier you're living near, who's across the frontier, who you find across the frontier, and what happens today. It's interesting to think of where if the wild one is at one point external, but then as frontiers expand, the wild one becomes internal. Today, our concept of the wild one must be an internal state. And it seems to be very tied up to education. You know, who's educated and who's not educated is how we define who's wild and who's not wild. But of course, that's problematic because by what standard do we judge as a good education versus a not education? Well, it tends to be if you think like me. Oh, you must be educated because you think like me. So therefore, the wild, I think, can contribute to what's the term we talk about today? Tribalism, right? Tribalism. And what do tribes tend to define themselves as relative to the wild people? We have the tribes and everyone outside is not part of the tribe. There's an othering. So obviously the history of the wild one is tied to othering. But it is very Freudian in the sense that there's something appealing about it. It brings you, if we're using that Garden of Eden language, it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, good and evil. There's something delicious about it, something tasty, something that you shouldn't bite into, because if you do, you'll be fallen, but at the same time, it has an appeal to it. So it's this very complicated symbol that it is really, really interesting to think going through history, how it has been so relevant to the formation of a social order on who is defined as wild. You're uneducated? Well, you're wild. Oh, you live outside the city state? You must be wild. Oh, you're not one of the chosen people. You're not one of the elect, God's elect. You must be a sinner. You must be the wild one. And the history of the othering. And what's curious today in our pluralistic society, where you don't have any frontier, because it's almost like when there was a frontier, you could almost get away with talking about the wild people and not be like a bigot or a xenophobe or something, because yeah, they're across the frontier. It's just kind of a hard fact. They're across the frontier. So they're wild. They're not part of the city state. But today, because of our information technology and the fact that everyone is connected and you have these different education, it's like obvious you can't call someone wild without being problematic. And yet we still find ways to do it. You know, we still find various mental gymnastics to do it. It's like, I'm not saying liberals are all wild ones. I'm just saying they're destroying America and we got to stop them if you're the conservative or something, right? Or, you know, and so there's this, it's interesting. And that is, I think you could talk about Freud in that context. And maybe the next one will be around that. I liked how you're right, Davood. The last one was about irrationality. There's continuity here. Exactly right. So I think it puts, you know, that was good, Davood. I missed that because I was too busy thinking about my Jack Black voice and saying, wow. So I missed that. That is good. But it is really interesting. It almost would be curious to just follow the history of, I guess you could call it the other. Is it just the other at the end of the day? The history of the other in philosophical grounding, political grounding, religious grounding, and almost, well, and I guess it's interesting with Judaism because you brought up Judaism, and I heard a Jewish scholar say this once, and I'm not, you know, I thought it was very interesting. We were saying, he's like, you know, in most religions, say Christianity, you've got the elect and you have the non-elect, right? You have the people who believe and the people who don't believe. Whereas in Judaism, it's more like you're moral or not. It's like, yes, God has a chosen people. Yes, God is working through a people, but anyone can be moral and therefore part of the order. And that's because in Judaism, there's much less emphasis on life after death, salvation and different things like that. It's more of creating the correct order on earth, you know, the correct temple, and how anyone can be part of that. Now, again, I'm no expert on Judaism, but I thought that was very interesting, which that would contribute to more of an external where you just relate to them and say, oh, well, they're a good person, right? But if it becomes more about like you have to believe certain things about Jesus. Well, that's much more existential, right? Like you have to like relate and almost kind of like individually interrogate. I don't want to use the language interrogate. That's a little strong, but there's like an individual, but you can't just see if they morally participate in the society and therefore aren't wild. It becomes more and more existential to determine who are the wild ones and who are not, which again, in some ways contributes to humility, because it's like, oh, anyone can be, part of the civilization, quote unquote, God, the city of God, be brought up against and not. But at the same time, it's interesting to think how that can contribute a nervousness and a paranoia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about how distancing yourself from the city or from civilization was kind of a reverse of what's been a common topic of critical theory for the past 40 or 50 years, which is, Daniel, you talked about what is essentially globalization, our increasing connectedness with one another, but also here's my cat, would the opposite of sort of distancing yourself from the city being colonizing, not just colonizing a particular part of a land, but colonizing a person or a people. And whether the movement is getting further away from the city or coming in on the city to impose sort of hegemonic power on it. Either way, there's a kind of a tension between yourself and what you're moving away from or toward that we can't get away from, that we always define ourselves against, again, usually negatively. I was thinking about that.
Do you mean this phenomenon, this recent phenomenon that people kind of want to claim their sanity? They want to claim their agency by moving away from large cities and having more local, relationship to the land. And
there is that's a whole nother thing to talk about, actually. But I was talking about the rise of colonial and post-colonial theory in the field of critical studies.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with sort of like it's a whole subgenre in literary criticism? Take for example, Europe. I mean, we could talk about it in Europe, but a much more contemporary example would be Africa, right? This is a continent of 50 or so countries, many of which, until very, very recently, many people living in living memory were colonized by the great European powers. Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, the Congo, famously was one horrible example. But what did it do to a person's mind? Like Frantz Fanon, Black Faces, White Masks, that sort of concept. That was maybe one of the first great works about what I'm talking about. He's talking about when you come in and impose this power, another civilization, another way of living, imposing its power on someone. It's not the wild man, but it is a different kind of power relation. It's not just people going about their daily lives. It's having another way of life imposed on you. What does that do to the literature you produce? What does that do to, so it's sort of a whole huge body of theory that looks at how it changes. Davood, you might know of the book. Fanon was a psychoanalyst back in the 40s and 50s. You may have read it, I don't know. But
I haven't read it, but I know it.
He talks about that and what it does to the colonized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe the colonized response, the person who's colonized, maybe their response could be an intentional embrace of this wildness as a way of getting out of that,
could be
out of constraints.
And very often it's a very concerted, aggressive rejection of it. Mm-hmm. For the purposes of maintaining their own identity, their own unique culture, civilization, to be distinct from the civilization that's being imposed on them.
Because from the, yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, I'm interrupting. I'm
No,
so
no,
sorry.
no.
I only have rain and lightning as
The background, it's kind of wild, but it's not as cool as cats. So I'm really sorry, guys. I'm trying to add the jungle sound, maybe. Is that what we're doing here? But well, I was just going to add that the concept of wildness directly gets tied into colonialization. I mean, with Fanon, who, I believe he had some discussions with Sartre, and obviously you could tie it to the double consciousness of Du Bois and different things. And it's kind of interesting because it's almost like you have the frontier, and you have one side of the consciousness and the other. And during colonialization, the frontier was externalized, and gradually, increasingly, it's internalized in globalization, say under capitalism, because everyone is maybe doing a job that they feel alienated by, and you can get into the bad, all these different things. And it's interesting because if you think that the other is a wild man, you can kind of always shape it to justify a colonialism, because either A, they're crazy and we need to stop them. B, they're noble and wonderful and we need to go learn from them, and make them part of our civilization. 3, they're not civilized, so we're bringing them civilization. So it's very interesting where it's very hard to find a logic of wildness that doesn't justify an effort of colonialization, if in fact you want to engage with it. Because I mean, the only reason you wouldn't engage with them is maybe as you thought they were a really powerful empire. Well, almost by definition, that means they're not wild. Like you would almost by definition. So wildness almost always contributes to, if you want, an invasion spirit, a sort of moving in spirit, which is again why it can be problematic today if that concept's still around, because say if conservatives think liberals are destroying America, well then it's justified to stop them, right? Or if you flip it around and conservatives are trying to destroy America, then you're justified to stop them. And I keep using that, but that's where the concept of wildness can be problematic, because it always brings with it an invasive spirit. And with that, if that invasion occurs, then it almost has to lead to alienation of those people who are being, and then on you, then also too, it can kind of work back, because if you came into the noble savage and found out what they were really like, or you like, what kind of person am I to do this invasion? What kind of person, did I really think I could change people? Or then if you get in violence with them, you have to engage with mental gymnastics to justify the invasion. So there's always something, the frontier. I guess I have this image where you have in history, the frontier is externalized between the city. And I like the distinctions he makes between the wilderness, the countryside, and the city. But if you have the city and the country, there's an external frontier. But as you go through history and more the external frontiers are discovered and we go across them, now it's almost like an internal frontier. And then you get into the age of the Deleuzian schizoanalysis, where we all have these, different consciousnesses. We go to work as one person at our job. We come home and we're another person at our house. We're another person online. There's all these different sort of people. So we have these kind of triple and consciousnesses in different things. So it's interesting for me. I think of this movement of the frontier inward until it's then a split in ourselves.
There are still at a few instances where we detect wildness as something very clearly outside. Think, for example, about the concept psychopathy, so psychopaths, and there are lots of popular books about the psychopath, how to detect them, how to deal with them. And a psychopath is someone who's not a person who is just untouched by civilization in a natural state of being, but somebody who is irredeemable, somebody who, if they act as a decent person, they are pretending to be doing that. Maybe we can, so if that's a whole person that gets that label. We can maybe think about narcissists in a similar way, assuming that such people can be labeled, identified. I'm not so sure about schizophrenia, but psychopathy is something that kind of evokes fear in people, fear and anxiety, and people want to know if the person who they are dealing with, and we have all heard stories about psychopaths who take advantage of people, rise to power and get to the top of their organization, and they are ruthless. So again, going back to that analogy of that has its roots in the Jewish tradition, there is the selected people, the Jewish people themselves, and then there's the Gentiles, who are the natural human beings who can be saved. And then there is a third category of the wild man. That kind of maps onto the symbolic, you can think about the Jewish people as the symbolic, as the givers of orders, and then the imaginary, the Gentiles, and then the real, the wild man represents Lacanian real realm or register. So we kind of have this, maybe we can think about terrorists in a similar way, but yeah, we kind of have these moments where we identify a person or a group as something terrifying. Maybe that is our way of using this concept, wild.
Speaking of totally crazy.
Oh, nice. I love how calm. Is it a he or a she? I love how calm she is. Yeah, not disturbing you at all.
I want to cross this frontier and be in that room. I want to cross this digital frontier and be in that room with that cat laying with it. I feel like that is definitely a noble, underlying noble savage.
Yeah.
Do you want to know what she's done for the last 18 hours?
No.
What have you done for the last 18 hours?
This.
I feel like I'm living my life wrong.
That's the most she's done in the last.
Oh, look at that.
Your cat kissed me. I feel accepted. I don't feel wild anymore. I've been accepted into this society and this community.
Yeah, I'm
God
also
bless you,
redeemed.
kitty.
I didn't mean to derail the video. I thought since we were just showing off our animals.
No, it's about wild ones. This is perfect. That's the only non-wild one here. Your cat is the only wild. We needed some civilization. I'm so glad your cat showed up.
Look at that dollop of cat. Look at that. That is the ultimate American cat right there.
It's going to be our most popular video. There was literally a cat in it. This is now
a cat video. We've done it. We have arrived.
We have made it.
That needs to
arrived.
be the screenshot for the video, Davood editor.
That's right. Okay.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, make sure on that. This is our cat video.
That's right.
This is our cat video. Well, it gets into interesting. I was going to know.
Because there's almost like you can get into wild versus criminal versus like on, wild being a designation because of where you're located and criminal because of actions you do, or you're a manipulator because of thoughts you have. And it's interesting because like, it's almost like for the noble savage, it was like, because you are located here, because you have this designation that you are this. But I think it's exactly what you say, Davood. Now we're looking for, because we can't designate wild so much anymore by location, except maybe this person in the Amazon I mentioned, but it's very rare cases, except maybe Martians, maybe Martians are the noble savage. But anyway, so now what we're doing is, since we can't spatially and geographically locate them, we're thinking about wildness in terms of psychology and criminal and design and different things like that. And maybe the popularity of the Squid Games or the, see Davood's channel right now immediately, or it's like shows of the Sopranos and different things suggests that we actually still have a hunger for the wild one, that the wild one, even though they've changed into the quote unquote criminal, because you can even get into the history, I guess, when and I can't remember which one of the movie critics who you will soon best, Davood, with your movie reviews and show reviews, he was talking about how in America
that voice, can you imagine?
I mean, they don't have a chance, Davood.
Oh my God.
It's straight up silk when you
now.
speak. But he was talking about how in the old movies in America, the criminal, the gangster, the outlaw was like a good guy. They were like fighting it. I guess Cool Hand Luke or something like Shawshank Redemption. We could talk about it. And that gradually now we're moving to sort of movies like Seven, or sort of the psychopath person, and how it's kind of moved away, where it's almost like now we don't really want the archetypical hero who's, the Jesus figure. I guess the other one is Stone Angel. That's I can't remember that movie. That's an old movie, but that's a really good movie. And that now that we've had the kind of heroic archetype fix, we now want the wild one fix, again, kind of going in these different functions of the wild one. It's a curious thing, but it's all Freudian. And I guess if I were to take a stab, and I'd be curious what you think of this, because I was reading the wild one and I'm like, what in the world does this have to do with history? And I have this, is there something to be said that if you believe that wild people are outside and you're in a civilization and therefore you're educated, is it almost where you don't worry so much then about relativizing history? Because, you're the good people, you're the educated people. And so therefore the idea of history as literature would not disturb you so much, because we're encountering history within the city, right? But, once we can be the wild ones, Christianity and it's internalized. Well, crap, we need science now. Everything must be science, because we got to make sure that the wildness inside of us is taken care of. And we could be wild. So the idea of approaching history as literature is dangerous, because we all secretly want to be wild, and we all secretly want crazy relativism, quote unquote. So if you give people the idea of history as literature, they won't be able to handle it. So now everything has to be science. Whereas, and it's funny because if you look at Greek, I mean, the history books are, this is obviously correlation does not imply causation, but the Phidias, the Peloponnesian Wars, and all these history accounts are more literary, right? The Greek historical accounts are more literary. So, I just wonder if there's also something where if you exist in a civilization that goes, oh, because we're in the city state, we're educated, then you're actually, because you're less existentially nervous, to allude to what I've been saying, I've said a bunch of times, you actually don't feel the need to scientize everything, because you feel kind of more confident in what individuals can handle. Whereas today, if everyone could be the wild one, we all have that within, then giving us, then it would be too dangerous to give us the idea of history as literature, because who knows what we could do and take that. So that was a thought I had. That is my effort to connect it to the rest of the book. We can all get thumbs down or thumbs up. Please don't kill me because I didn't do the stop. What is it in the Squid Games? Go stop game wrong. If I messed up, just thumbs up. But that was what I was kind of thinking about. I was like, oh well, if you believe the wild ones are outside and you're inside the city, then you don't have to worry about. You don't need everything to be science so much because you don't need that leash per se. You don't need that constraint on yourself so much. So that was a thought I had.
Mm-hmm. Funny, because I believe that the spirit of capitalism it drives all of us to feel atomized and to feel like we are separate from the rest of society. And in a way, we all feel like we are outside in a sense, which is why so many people identify with the Joker figure or all these Squid Game characters they have given expression to that side of themselves. So they have made it official. They've crossed that boundary and said, we do not belong and we are going to do something about it. Whereas most of us kind of quietly not deal with it or just postpone it and say, we are in the city, but we are really not, because being in a city is like being subject to the relationships of the city. And,
well, to just not to interrupt, but I think you're
exactly right. We're entering an age of something very unique, where we are collections of idiots. If we use the idiot language in the classical sense, we are literally, the idiot is outside and doing their own thing. Well, now it's like we're collections of idiots. This very paradoxical state that capitalism has put us in. And we're like, what do we do? What is it? How do you get by? And I think it does indeed make the Joker and these different characters appealing.
Mm-hmm. All right, any final words of wisdom? Any additional?
Well, I think the cat should speak.
We have saturated the video.
Any initial words of wisdom?
No,
I'm just...
The cat, dude, John, the cat
We
purred.
have done it.
I think we've had some, the cat purred.
All right, everybody, it was a pleasure. Let us stop the recording.